A lovely welcome to our next speaker, Rochelle March, the head of ESG Product at Dun Bradstreet. She specializes in impact analysis related to carbon, water, and the Sustainable Development Goals and applying machine learning to ESG products. She also teaches data and analytics at Bard's College MBA program and sits on an advisory board for USL Technology Incorporated, a minority and a woman-owned sustainable building and engineering company. Rochelle will be talking about how to build a global data supply chain to support a machine learning built sustainability data set. Take it, Rochelle. Thank you so much.
Hi there, my name's Rochelle March, and I'm head of ESG Product at Dun Bradstreet. Today, I'm going to be talking about how we built a global data supply chain to support a machine learning enabled sustainability data set or ESG data set on companies and their value chains and the different methodologies we use for that and the steps we use to compile that. So I'll start with talking a little bit about sustainability data or ESG data, environmental social governance data. It's a new type of information becoming more popular in the last 5 or so years that captures externalities and how companies are managing their resources, like the environment, their carbon emissions, their people, and also if they're behaving in a transparent and accountable way. I bring up this slide of Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, the largest asset management company in the world. This company owns a little bit of almost every company that's out there. And, I bring this up because in his last letter to CEOs, he's really stressing sustainability and not to focus on environmental issues because we're, quote, environmentalists, but because we are capitalists and we need to make sure that the resources that are there today are going to be there tomorrow to support our economies. So there's a bit of a values based component around ESG, but also very valuable component since the environment, labor, people, trustworthy systems are the bedrock that supports our economies. And what's interesting is, Larry Fink here is influencing that from an asset management perspective. Many other asset managers are as well. And this puts pressure on large multinational public companies who also need to start to answer to these questions. And recently, those companies are also putting pressure on their suppliers and private companies and even small and medium businesses to get together their data in terms of what they're doing on ESG. A little bit of more background, a lot of ESG movement has been propelled by investors and activists, investors, and then I would say NGOs and advocacy for more transparency and aligning investments with values. The best example we have historically is actually from the Quakers who decided not to invest in certain sin areas because they didn't agree with that. Priority. And then over time, you see a combination of an emergence of certain types of funds that are focused on either social or environmental issues and also focusing events. South Africa apartheid, Nike sweatshop labor scandal, Exxon Valdez spill. These were all moments in history where people realized that we couldn't take social and environmental and governance issues for granted, and we needed to have them integrated into our financial decision making and our economies. And today, you see a really big emergence of even new regulation, primarily in Europe, but you see it emerging in the US and Asia as well, that's starting to communicate the importance of these metrics and how to track them. These metrics, though, are historically very difficult to track, and I'll get into that a little bit later. I mentioned the increasing regulation. You can see a number of acts here that many of which have only occurred in the last couple of years, predominantly around environment, but also human rights, supply chain, also data privacy, as that's emerged as a really large area of focus. That does fall under generally the social dimension of ESG. And then the final reason why ESG is becoming very popular is because it's attracting a lot of capital. So last year was the first year that more bonds were underwritten for ESG or sustainability focused projects than fossil fuel projects. And you can see a lot of the investment money going into ESG funds, primarily steered by millennials and younger who really want to put their values with the value of their investments, but also because a lot of these focuses like clean energy, responsible companies, companies with diverse boards, and so on, tend to also perform better, and at least be aware of challenges on the horizon and be better equipped to deal with them. So in closing, ESG has really emerged as a mainstream data type that anyone from banks to companies to those large asset managers are working with to get more insight on what companies are doing and how they manage their resources. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background on that before getting into how Dun& Bradstreet is compiling a large global data set to capture this for not only public companies where there's a lot of disclosure, but also private companies. This framework you see here is synthesized from some of the leading sustainability frameworks that are out there. It's a lot of really nice acronyms: GRI, Global Reporting Initiative; CDP, formerly Carbon Disclosure Project; SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board; and TCFD, Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosure, and many others. We looked across these frameworks to understand which metrics are echoed throughout and how can we put them together into one that serves as our infrastructure for data capture. So, as we look through the data we have and the data we're sourcing, the data we're building, what data points can give us an indicative sense of how a company is performing in each of these topic areas? We might not have data for every one of these areas. It's quite a holistic spread of information, but we want to gather at least enough to inform how a company may be performing in a holistic way on ESG. So, into some of the nitty gritty. So, one of the interesting components of Dun and Bradstreet is its global data cloud, which is a huge data lake repository of information on businesses. We take in over 30,000 sources. It's on 460 million different business records, so almost every company in the world. And what's interesting is that we organize this by what's called the DUNS number, which is a unique identifier to a company, kind of like a social security number, but on a company level. And what's helpful about this DUNS number is often companies will require companies to have this to show that they are a valid entity and that it's safe to do business with them. To get a DUNS number, you have to go through some registration, which is where Dun and Bradstreet then is able to gather some information on these companies and start to build out their profile of each one of these entities. So that DUNS can be easily appended new information to start to build, the profile of that company. And another thing that's very important is that DUNS is organized in the hierarchy of that company to say its parent company, its subsidiary. You can even have a DUNS in an individual facility or branch, which are also organized up to the parent company and so on. So this can be really useful for understanding ultimate ownership, who owns what and where is doing business with whom and where. And you can glean a lot of really interesting insights from that. This database is primarily a graph database that is constantly changing, has a lot of different variables. It's very large, it's very complex, and it's where we're able to gather a lot of initial information on companies. In addition to that, we look across a number of other sources. So, this first column here, sorry, I was going to sneeze, excuse me. This first column here refers to the Dun and Bradstreet Data Cloud. And as I mentioned, many different sources, what we call identity resolution, or linking that DUNS number to the right company and to its company family. And then also including a lot of data on what companies are spending on, who they're spending it with. So here we can look at spend on, say, philanthropic numbers, employee training, industrial safety and equipment. These would all be topics under the social dimension of ESG. We also gather a lot of compliance information, environmental compliance or non-compliance, lawsuits, liens, inquiries by government, and so on. And then we have some custom data sets in there as well, like our minority owned data set, which looks at if a company is 51% or more owned by a minority. In addition to that, we also append and match lots of other structured and unstructured sources throughout. So we take in global news where we link individual articles to the DUNS number and then run sentiment analysis to understand if there are any controversial triggers related to ESG or beneficial. We take in legal and government information from tons of different government statistical sites, always with permission, of course, but there we run scraping and we take in the information, we match it to the DUNS, and then we run the sentiment and also go through quality processing. Company reports and websites are a traditionally large source of ESG information. These are self disclosed reports about what a company is doing and what they're focusing on. Very helpful information, although we do find the sentiment tends to run overly positive. But this is a really great place. And here we're using OCR and NLP and other types of ways to extract the text and then derive meaning from it. And then a big part too is simply web scraping from many different sources. We look at social media for Twitter accounts owned by the companies. We're gathering in lots of different certifications. We scrape the company websites to see if there are any icons, and we cross check that against certification databases. This is always ongoing, and every month we ingest hundreds of different sources that are giving us a little bit of a bigger look across companies and across our universe. And then in April, we're also launching a self assessment where companies can directly either change or add information to what we already have on them. This is the quick overview of how it all fits together. This is very simplistic, but at a high level, you have all the data sources on the left. We go through lots of processing and quality assurance. This is where we would check the data, we would match it to the right DUNS, we would standardize it or normalize it into whatever it needs to be in. And then we get into our analytical model, and I'll talk about this in a bit more. But essentially, for the high level risk scores, ESG, ES, and G, we normalize it from a range of 1 to 5, 5 being the highest risk, 1 being the lowest risk. And we also weight them according to what factors have a more financially material impact on companies. And then we also provide the 31 topics that I showed previously in that framework, unweighted from 0 to 100 to get a sense of how companies are performing there. This is a topic example, a little bit hard to see, but what's helpful about this is that there are two different types of variables, more or less. We have numeric variables, or those that are either discrete or continuous, and then we have textual variables, qualitative information that we use NLP on, for example. So the numeric and continuous variables. Oh, yep. We'll go to that in a second. Um, Essentially, we gather that, we normalize it by some factor generally. So this might be revenue, employee number of employees, square footage, and then we're able to compare that factor to other companies and derive a relative benchmark, which then goes into the ESG score. Textual data, we're working with polarity, and there we go from -1 to 1, -1 being negative polarity and 1 being positive to understand where on that spectrum a company is. And then we aggregate all of the sources together according to their topic focus. So, a little bit more detail for the textual data, like company reports, websites, news, NGO data too. We created a number of proprietary keywords specific to the ESG ontology, and we created that using a number of deep learning models, and something that we're always iterating on as well. We've just engaged in creating subtopics to help further crystallize that and organize that. A big issue with NLP and ESG data is there can be a lot of what's called greenwashing or overstated claims of sustainability that may not be authentic. So we're always working on how to kind of filter that out and really focus on the real information. And then to detect the polarity, we created our own ESG BERT model to run over the sentences and identify keywords that are then related directly to those 31 topics. And those phrases are collected, evaluated, and organized into distinct keywords. Could be what we call bigrams, which is two keywords in one phrase, trigrams, and so on, that are then combined across the sources and essentially averaged. So you might have a number of instances across news, across reports, across websites, across um, NGO databases and so on. And so we link those to the distinct topics, and then we run the analysis and then score them. And as I mentioned, numeric values are more simple in some ways. This might be, number of non-compliance or spend on philanthropy, as I mentioned previously, or number of days of delayed payments to a supplier. A good proxy of a company's relationship to their supplier. And here we simply, scale and normalize, and then also assign the -1 to 1 range, which could be continuous depending on the variable. I'll get a little bit into the NLP and deep learning that we used to, one, create the library, to run the analysis on it, and then how that works in practice in an operational sense. So word embedding is essentially a numerical representation of text. There's some great models out there. We loved, Google's pre-trained word embedding is using 3.5 billion words in Google News articles, something we use to get us started. And what's interesting about this is it's a great way to detect associated words, synonyms, words that are found together a lot in certain phrases, and so on. And so this helps to create our first ontology of ESG that sets the foundation of what we're looking for. So, with news, we take in millions of news articles every day as well. And we've just started taking in a lot more of international news too. And for that, we use a multilingual NLP model that we just finished actually testing and using. So, there's lots of iteration, especially as you embark on a global coverage of data. Currently, we take that through FTP servers, depending on the source. We map them then to the Dun. So again, it's hyper important that we make sure the right article is associated with the right company. And since everything in our global data cloud is organized by the Duns, that is really our key indexing that we use. Then we use AWS to run the general text analysis and tag for certain topics and themes so we can identify them based on keyword. And then we move it over to Google Colab to complete the actual polarity and the sentiment analysis. And then the analytical process is happening over in Databricks. We put it into the analytical model and do that scoring from -1 to 1. So lots of different platforms, infrastructures, all working together. And this is just a slice of the large pie of services and tools that we're using at Dun and Bradstreet to take into account different data that we're ingesting all of the time. Website data is pretty similar, with the exception that we're doing the DUNS to domain mapping, and the domain would be the URL that we glean for the company. So there, we're identifying the website and then linking it directly to the DUNS based on the information. Many times we may already have a website in-house linked to a company. When they signed up for the DUNS, they entered this information or entered it at a later date. So that mapping doesn't necessarily have to take too long. It can be simply a confirmation. And then the rest of these steps are very similar. The scraping we do on AWS as well, and then the NLP, the tagging, the sentiment analysis, and the analytical scoring happening on the same platforms. Little more detail, for web scraping, we attain a list of all the hyperlinks present on a home page of a website. We shortlist those relevant URLs based on our ESG keywords. So we are running it on that shortlist to prioritize which links or which pages we'd want to analyze for ESG. And then we scrape all the data present on those web pages and perform NLP on the textual data. The NLP goes through a very classic NLP process to prepare for analysis. We tokenize it or we break it into sentences. We pre-process them, such as removing stop words, removing accents, lemmatizing them, cleaning the sentence by removing special characters, just getting the data really clean for analysis. And then we'll tag each sentence to the proper E, S, and G dimension based on our pre-mapping of or that ontology to respective dimensions. And then we'll also tag each sentence kind of in that hierarchy. You've got ESG, you've got themes, and then topics as well. And then shortlist the sentences that has at least one mention of these themes and topics and move the output to an S3 bucket that we'll later pull from for the final analysis. The sentiment analysis uh, is when we load the sentences to collab from the S3 bucket. We're using a number of models, include BERT and Zero Shot, to perform that sentiment analysis on the shortlisted sentences. And this is also an area where we're always iterating and trying different models, especially as the language around ESG is changing. And then after we tag the polarity for each of the sentences, we aggregate the sentiment at the DUNS level, both at the topic and theme level. So our final scores are going to be providing an indication of how a company is performing at an individual topic, and then also at a higher theme level that combines multiple topics. And then we calculate that final index creation on the Databricks platform. So far, we've been very successful in building this data set, rolling it out to multiple countries. Today, we cover almost 27 million companies, which is, the largest ESG data set out there today. And that's 11 different geographies. And I think we're on track to expand to 22 more geographies next month, kicking that number up to another 6 million. And continuously expanding from there. So the data itself can be available for use, either file download, depending on how big your sample is, or API. And then we also ingest it into specific products like user interfaces and online reports that can be a user-friendly focus for customers. This is just a quick Power BI visualization example of what a company's supply chain could look like. So one area that we're very focused on is procurement. This is traditionally a very non transparent area for ESG. Small companies, suppliers, anybody except those big multinational companies that have a lot of resources and are also under pressure to disclose information, we generally don't know that much about in terms of ESG. So, this is a big area where, because Dun Bradstreet has such a big footprint in the private company space, we're able to really get insight into this area for the first time. So this is actually looking at Dun& Bradstreet's own supply chain, about 1,200 suppliers, not that big, but still big enough number that a sustainability director would have difficulty tracking that manually, obviously. So it helps to have something that's monitoring it for you in an automatic fashion. Across the portfolio, we're performing a little bit better than the industry average, that 2.09 versus 2.36. That's a weighted average of all of the companies across the supply chain. But the most useful piece of information is that distribution curve that's telling you that the majority of companies in the portfolio are lower risk, 3 and below, but there's a handful of higher risk ones that are the ones you probably would want to focus on first. Track them month to month. The data is updated on a monthly frequency. Look into their data set, maybe ask them for more information as well. And we have this, a breakdown on the environmental rankings. You can see the comparison to the industry average, a breakdown of the distribution, and also the average scores across specific themes. So this is in topic level, but the larger themes, GHG emission and climate, environmental risk, which would include compliance, natural resources like energy, water and waste management, and also environmental opportunities, environmental certifications, renewable energy initiatives, sustainable product initiatives, and so on. Social as well, you can similar breakdown and also several of these social themes. uh, Product and service, how companies are offering their product and service, how they're engaging with their suppliers, supplier engagement, how they manage human capital, their employees and communities, customer engagement, how they are communicating with their customers, making them aware of the products, being able to get in touch with them, and so on, or investing in initiatives like CRMs that help to reach out to customers, community engagement like philanthropy, donations, and so on, and also any social certifications that are applicable. And same with governance. Here we're looking a lot more at compliance, business transparency, corporate behaviors, and or business resiliency. How well set up is this company to deal with volatile events, both financially and just operationally, whether those events are economic downturns or natural disasters. One thing we do too is provide a little more background of what's driving the main scores. So, materiality again is what's going to be the most financially material to a company based on sector. Energy management might not be that material to a financial company that is only has a couple of offices open. They don't have much of an impact, but energy management is going to be front and center for a utility company, for example. So here too, you can see the main reasons driving the score and the direction or the polarity they're going in, negative, positive, or remaining neutral. And then a simple breakdown of the percentage of data across the portfolio that's available. It's those bars. And then the average ESG score from 0 to 100, 100 being the best across the portfolio. So, one thing that's worth mentioning is we do not estimate or model to gap fill any of the data, which is an interesting approach given that we cover such a large universe of companies. Previously mentioned about 27 million and growing. There's one exception. We model a little bit for greenhouse gas emissions because that information is super important, pretty easy to directionally model, and something that is just very sparse, but often regulatory required or going to be. So you may not see full coverage of data across a portfolio, but at least you know that each one of those data points is based on company specific information. So I'll wrap this up shortly, but one thing to mention too is what's the impact of this information and how do we validate that this information is useful? So we run validation exercises to see if there's any, consistent correlations. Here we're looking at the ESG scores across public and private companies over a 5-year period against change in sales growth. And you can see that those companies that are performing well on management of ESG issues also have a higher sales growth over the last 5 years. You can break it down too into individual themes. So here's how companies are managing greenhouse gas emissions and climate. And what's interesting here is even during that year one, which would have been 2020 in this analysis, very tough year for companies, obviously, but companies that were managing their greenhouse gas emissions well had less of a loss than those that weren't. So, again, kind of supporting this hypothesis that companies that manage ESG issues are probably well managed companies in general. And then DNB has a number of other risk factors that we gauge against. So here we're looking at supplier risk indicators that look at the probability of a company going out of business over a year or over a 90-day term. And we do see here that companies with poor ESG performance are more likely to have a higher risk of company inactivity. Inactivity caused from bankruptcy, going out of business, or acquisition. And, of course, we see this for public companies in terms of net income. Those with good ESG scores tend to have a higher net income, although not all the time. And also in the higher quartile, we can see of ESG scores, we can see a higher return than the S&P 500 benchmark over a 3, 5, 10, and 15 period. Here, looking at May of 2020, and this continues to be a trend. And then a metric that's near and dear to Dun and Bradstreet, because we do a lot of credit work, is delinquency rates. This is late payments. So here too, we continue to see a correlation between companies that do well on ESG and a low level of late payments, and the opposite. So that's, we see this consistent through greenhouse gas emission climate management, as well as how well they're engaging with their suppliers, and then also how resilient they are to setbacks. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you a bit about ESG, and also how we're applying a number of machine learning and data techniques to get the best information out that we can on a very large group of companies, which requires a large amount of infrastructure and operational components to make that happen. So thank you so much, and you can reach out to me at the contact here.